So we're back with lesson 11. We're working on our form. We've set up our employer details form. We've added the forms module into our Angular component, our app.module.ts. And we've set up properties. So there are three things we needed to do. We added forms module to app.module.ts and we've imported it. We've set up properties for each of our inputs in our employer component. And then we've created an HTML form and we've used the ng model directive to add two-way data binding between each input and a corresponding property in the form. So now we want to create a series of post methods so that when we fill out this form, we can actually wind up submitting this data. And there's a chain. We're going to go from our form, our HTML, first to our component. So we're going to need a method in the component. Our component is then going to hand the data to our Angular service. Our Angular service is going to make an HTTP call. Instead of calling get, it's going to call the post method on our server API. And our server API and our controller, right now we've only got a get method. We also need a post method. So we're going to walk through these various layers. We'll start in the back end, like we did last week. So we're going to jump over to our job server and open up our employer controller. So this is our post command. So we're actually going to use the same URL. So unlike our original Node application, I think we did post at employer/create. The convention when we're building a REST API is that we actually use the same URL for most of our API calls. We just change the method. So instead of get, we're going to use the post method. But we don't, by convention, create a separate endpoint. So it's still going to be star with request and response. So this is just our usual Node code. Although again, we're only returning JSON. We're not rendering any sort of view. So when we get a post request, we'll use Mongoose and we'll call employer.create. And we just pass in our request body. We don't need to map each field because our request body, remember, it's already going to be in the format of a JSON object that has 4 attributes: name, location, description, and website. So we'll try to save and we will get back either an error or an employer record, an employer document. Our error handling will be the same. If we get an error, we'll just return a JSON response. We'll return the error in JSON. Again, we'll set a 400 code, which is bad request. Otherwise, we'll return a JSON response that has the new employer. That would also include the ID that gets generated by MongoDB with the status of 201. And if we look up the HTTP status codes, in the docs, so 201, request succeeded and a new resource was created. So we could send a 200 response, which just means okay. But I think this is a more descriptive response. This is typically the response sent after post requests. So we're creating a new document. So we're going to send a 201. It's a little more descriptive than just a 200. So it means a new resource was created. So our API is really simple, really lightweight, right? We're just using Mongoose to save. We're just using Mongoose. We're trying to create a new document in MongoDB from the request body, which will be a JSON representation of the fields and values from our form. So we'll save this. Any questions about the post method here? So we can make different types of calls to the same URL. Get will run a query, and post will run a save operation. So the method type determines what happens inside, even though the URL is the exact same. We'll probably see this in typical APIs. If we just go and look, I think I like the Spotify API. So we can see this in their documentation. So for example, let me just see if they've got any post requests here. Okay, right, so here they've got a get for getting playlist items. So here's the URL, get at /playlists, the ID, and then the tracks. So that will return in JSON all of the items on their playlist. However, right underneath, if we want to add an item to the playlist, we've got post, and you'll see it's the same URL, /playlist/ID/tracks. So the same URL is used to handle both a get request for fetching data and a post request for saving new data. Okay, so we're mimicking this, and they've used the same kind of response, that our post request returns 201 if it's successful, and the get request returns 200. So we're sort of mimicking, and this is the convention when we're building a REST API. So I'm just following these conventions around the URLs and the types of status codes that get typically sent in response. So this should be all we have to do on the back end for saving a new employer. But now we also need to call this method from our Angular service. And then we also need to call it from the component. So we're basically writing almost 3 versions of this. Any questions about the post method before we jump over to our Angular service? I'm going to leave this project and move back to our Angular project. So we're going to go back to our Angular, our jobs client, and we want to go into our service file. And we're going to add a post method. So the post is going to save a new employer. So we'll create a method called add employer. And this is going to take an object, an employer object. So this will represent our form data. So in this case, we're going to return this.http.post. Our URL is the same. So we're still posting to API/employers, but it has another parameter here. So for get, we simply pass in the URL and get goes and fetches the JSON. With post, we also need to pass in the object we want to save, which is our employer. We've got to pass the form body here. And it wants us to define a type, so we can just say any. That makes our error go away. So our service can send to our employer. There's one more thing we're going to need to add onto our service that our post method needs that our get method doesn't need. So our get method simply requires one parameter, which is the URL. Our post method actually requires three parameters, we can see. So the first parameter, Visual Studio Code shows, is also the URL. Where are we sending this post to? The second parameter is the body. So this is our form. So this is the data we're sending. And the third parameter we're going to need to pass when we call post is some options. And it lists an HTTP header. When we're doing a post in Angular, we need to include a header to our URL. We need to specify that the content type is JSON. So we're going to add a third parameter here, which we need to do a little configuration and definition up at the top. So this is going to go we're going to create new HTTP headers. And then we are going to append on the content type. And we're going to set it as application JSON. So when we're sending form data, we're also wanting to pass in an HTTP header defining the request content type as JSON. And when we're doing our post method, we need to pass these as options. So if we're submitting form data, this content type is going to be needed. So we'll use this for our put method as well that will update an employer. Our get and our delete don't need it because we're not submitting form data in those instances. We're only submitting form data when we are updating or adding. Okay, so I've added lines 8 and 9, and then appended on this final parameter where we're going to. So I'm declaring these up here so we can use them in both our add and our update method. And that way I don't have to repeat this line of code inside both add and edit. I'm just declaring them globally inside our service this way. So our service call now from our Angular application outside of our Angular app to our server API, it's done. So we've written 2 of the 3 methods we need. We've got one in our server API, we've got one in our service. We now also need a method in our Angular component that will grab the properties from the form and then create a new employer object, which we'll call our add employer, which turns around and calls the server and passes in that data. Pardon me. So our last step here, our second last step, is to create a method in the component. And then we also need to invoke or call the component method in our form, in our HTML. So we need to trigger this chain of events when the user clicks the add button. So we'll go back to our component now. Doesn't really matter where in the component we create this. We're going to create an add employer method, which is void. It doesn't return anything. So we'll just create a new employer object from our form values. Oops. So we will create new JSON object from our form values. That's step one. Pass the new object to the service, which then calls post in our server REST API. So we've got this employer object. Now we can call this .service, which we declared in our constructor. So our component always uses our service. And then when I type dot, now I can see I have access to the add employer method. And we will just pass in our employer. And we'll just subscribe. We'll wait for a response. So what should happen when this call is complete? So we create a JSON object in our form. We call the add method in our service and we pass it in. So our service takes this object, calls post on our server API, passes it in as content JSON. Our server tries to save it to MongoDB and returns a status. So what should happen in our browser when we're done? What should happen next? So when I click the add button, our form should go to send the data to the component. Component sends it to the service sends it to the API sends it to the database. What should happen visually on our page when that's all done? I would suggest there are two things that should happen after we're done saving. And we've got some different options. Any ideas what you think we should see on our page when we're done triggering this chain of events? Something should happen on the left side of the page and something should happen on the right side of the page.
Oh, I think I know.
Yep. What do you think, Chris?
When you click on the word add, it'll add to the employers list.
Right. So over here, these values should show up here right away. I agree. And then what about within the form on the right side of the page?
Um, the words on the form should disappear.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we want to have happen. Thank you, Chris. So we want our employer list to refresh and we want our form values to disappear. And this will happen seemingly in real time. Our page is not going to reload, so you won't see any flickering in the browser. It should appear instantly. So we will refresh the list on the left and clear the form on the right. So we've already got in our component, we can refresh the list with one line of code. What method do we call? How do we get the list to update? Right? We've already built a method to populate our list. Right here on line 18, we've already written get employers. Right now, this runs when our component is initialized. So we can call it again. So we just say this.get employers. And that's going to update the list on the left. It'll requery the database and repopulate the left side of our screen. What we'll do here is we'll make a separate method to clear the form because we may want to call this a few different ways. So from a few different places. So we'll make it as a method that's reusable. We'll write a clear form method. And all we do is set each we'll just set each of our four properties to undefined. And that will automatically remove the form values, as Chris said, we need to do. So after we call this.get employers, we can now just call this.clear form. So that should accomplish both of the visual cues that our user wants to know when they tried to save that it worked. They'll see the new record basically move out of the form and into the list, and the form will be cleared. So we can reuse our get employers so it runs when our page first loads. It's also going to get called again every time we add a new employer. We want to refresh the list on the left side of the page. And then we want our form to clear. So now let's try this. So we basically have three different methods for adding an employer. One in our component. It calls the add employer in our service, which calls the post method in our API. So we're going to try this out. So I'm going to go and click my add button, and nothing happens. How come? Right? When I refresh, there's nothing new here. There's not actually any error, I don't think. So there's no errors. I think our code is correct, yet nothing happens. Our form doesn't clear. Our list doesn't update. There's one more thing we actually need to do. Any idea? The issue is actually in our HTML. So all the code we wrote is right. There's something we need to add here. Take a look at line 37. When we click that yellow button, nothing happens. So an Angular form doesn't work the way a regular HTML form works, right? If this was a regular HTML form, when we click the button, yeah, well, normally, if you use a button tag in a form, it submits automatically. But we're using Angular to handle the form. It's not a regular form submission. So what we need is a click handler. We need an Angular click handler, and we want to call our add employer method. So rather than do a traditional form submission where it posts to the server, we need to manually attach it. So Colton, you're on the right track. We don't need the submit type, but we need this Angular click directive to call the method of our component. So let's try that now. I'm going to try and add a new employer, and we can see what happens. So Tree Frog is in Newmarket. They specialize in Swift development. I think they're at treefrog.ca. So I'm going to try to add, and if this works, my list should update pretty much right away, and my form should clear. So there we go. I've saved to the database. See if this is the right URL. If not, oh yeah, here they are. And automatically our form cleared. So now we can add and we can read our data. Now we also want to be able to use our form for editing and deleting. So I want to be able to click on an employer, have it automatically populate the form, and when that happens, I want my add button to hide. I want an update button to appear instead. And then when we click it, it would also trigger this cascade of methods, but this time it would run a put, ultimately would run a put method in the back end. So it would update rather than creating a new record. And again, our update would be saved to the database, our list would update, and our form will clear. So there's a few steps involved in this process. First, we have to just be able to click and populate our form. So we can create a method in our component that gets called when we click on an employer name. And that method can use our data binding to populate our form. So go back to our component. And I'm going to add a select employer method. This is void. And our method will actually take, let's see if we can do it this way. Okay, we'll just do it this way. So our select will take 4 parameters. So we'll set out name, location, description. There may be a more efficient way to do this, but I know this way will work. And then we're going to populate the properties of each of these. We'll say this dot name equals name. So we want this method to be called whenever we click on an employer name in our list. So we're going to turn those employer names into links. And when we click a link, we're going to call select employer and pass in these 4 properties so that we can populate our form. So with this method, we can do that with one line, one little addition to our HTML. So I'm going to go back to the employer. I'm going to add an H5 tag. Around my employer name. We're going to come all the way up here. And I'm going to modify this a little. First of all, I'll just break this up, my H5. And I'm going to change my H5 tag. I'm just going to change it to an anchor. And I'll set the class as H5 instead. So I'm changing the H5 HTML elements to anchor tags, but I'll keep the class as H5 so our text is larger. And then we can add a click handler here that when you click the employer name, it will call our component. So we'll say click equals select employer. And we're going to pass in okay, we'll do it this way. Maybe not the most efficient, but we'll say employer.name. There's probably a better way to do this, but I know this is functional. So when we click on those employer names, it will call our select method in the component and it will pass in those 4 values. So this should populate our form. When we click on the employer name. Now we're going to have to add something to this. It's not complete. We'll probably have to finish this next week. We'll see if we've got time. We may not. So clicking the employer name, which we've converted into a link, will populate our form with the 4 properties of the employer. So now they're links. And when I click, my form values change. So that's good. Now we should also, these are links, we don't get the cursor, we don't get the little pointer. So we may also want to change the CSS here. So when I roll over an employer name, yeah, I see the rollover, but I don't get the little pointer indicating that it's a link I can click. So we can add that class to our style sheet. So if I go to styles.css, I think if I define it as, then I should be able to say cursor pointer. We'll see if that does it. May just be on the H5 itself, I'm not sure. Yeah, that works. So now I get my little pointer. By adding the H5. Now there's a couple of other things we still need to add into our front end. We don't want the add button to show up. We want the add button to be hidden, and we want an update button to appear instead. So we're also going to need to include the employer ID. When we have an employer ID value, we want to hide the add button and show the update button. When we have no ID, we want the add button to be visible. I also want to add a reset button because once I've selected an employer, there's really no way to clear out the form without adding a new one. So we can add a reset button as well. So we're going to need to make a few additions so that we know whether to show the add or update, and we also want the ability to clear the form. So I'll go back to my component. We're also going to add an underscore ID property as a string. We haven't needed the ID so far, but if we're going to edit, that ID is going to be necessary. We don't need it when adding an employer, but we can also add it to our clear out. Let's do our form reset first, and then we can also play around with our add and update buttons. So we'll define an underscore ID property as a string. When we're clearing the form, we also want to clear out that ID. And now we can deal with our buttons, showing or hiding, and also enabling a reset button or a clear button in our HTML. I'm going to go back down to the bottom of my form. First thing I'll add here is a reset button. So I have a button that says reset. And when we click it, it's going to call the clear method. So that will wipe out any of our form values. So clear is now called twice. It's called after we add a new employer, we clear the form. But also if our user clicks the reset button, we want to clear the form. Try this out. I'll add a little margin here between them. So now when I click on any employer, my form populates. If I want to remove it, I just click reset. So we're nulling out all the properties, and our Angular two-way data binding, it automatically clears the form. I think I need a little margin here around these buttons. I'll add to our class m-1 for each button. Whoop. There, that spaces them out a little bit. That's weird, not sure why I put it over there. Okay, I won't worry too much about that. So I've got add and reset here. So now we want to also put on an update button, and the add and update buttons can never show at the same time. When our form is clear, add should show up. But when we've selected an employer, we want add to disappear and we want update to be visible. We could also probably set a standard width for our buttons. So I'm going to add one more button here. So this button is going to say update. So now we've got 3 buttons. Maybe I'll give them all a fixed width, so I can just update that in our style sheet quickly. We don't have a class for button yet, so we'll say .btn. Maybe we'll try a width of 80 pixels and see how that looks. There, oh, that's good. But the issue now is both add and update are showing at the same time, and they should never both be visible. So this is where we can use our ID. So we're going to store this ID in a hidden field. When the ID has a value, we'll show update. When the ID is null or undefined, we'll show add. So only one of these buttons will be visible, but we won't see them both at the same time. So go back to my HTML. I'm just going to add a hidden field here. Well, I'll add the type equals hidden in a minute. I won't put it in yet. First, we'll make it visible, and then we'll hide it. So we're going to bind this with ngModel to our ID property. So we'll be able to see these IDs for now. We'll see this text box. We'll add a type equals hidden attribute in a moment. So when we're editing, it's going to populate. We'll need to populate the ID as well. So we'll add that hidden field to the bottom. And then we've got to scroll up to the top. When we clicked on an employer name, we'll now want to also add the ID here. So we're also going to say employer._ID. And this throws an error because our method in our component, it's only expecting the first 4 parameters. It's not expecting an ID. So we're going to have to add this 5th parameter here as well. So on our click where we're calling select employer, we'll wrap up shortly. I do have another meeting at 11 o'clock. Chris, I know, sorry, I thought my meeting was at 12. It's at 11, but I did get your message, which is good. So I'm going to go back to my component, and in the select, we'll also add underscore ID as a string. So when we select an employer, we also want to set, just like the other 4 properties, we want to set our ID. So if I click an employer now, we should also see their ID from MongoDB showing up at the bottom of the form. Like I said, we're going to hide it in a minute, but we can try this out. Okay, so I've modified line 52 and 57. So now when I click an employer, their ID shows up here. Pavliks, I get a different one. And then when I click reset, all of the inputs, including my ID, those disappear. So we can use some logic now. We can use an Angular directive to determine which of these buttons should be visible. When we have an ID, we want to see update. When the ID field is empty, we should see add, and the update button should be invisible. So we'll just add this functionality, and then we're going to stop for today. And we will finish off the ability to update, and then we'll also add a delete feature. We'll add that in next week, and then we'll look at bundling and deploying the app. So we just need a little bit of logic on both our add and update button. And the logic is the exact opposite. So on add, we're going to say star ng if not ID. If there is no, if the ID property is null or undefined, that makes this button visible. The update button has the reverse. When we have a value for our employer ID, the ng if will show us this button. So we've got an exclamation mark meaning false or not on add. We do not have that exclamation mark in the update. So this is going to toggle those 2 buttons. When our form first loads, we'll see add. If I click an employer, we'll see update. And when I click refresh or reset, add is going to come back. So we can use the Angular directives to show or hide elements at runtime. So notice update is gone when I come back to my page. Yet as soon as I click, add disappears. As long as I've got an ID, my update button is visible. As soon as I click reset, add comes back, update goes away. We can't update because there is no employer selected. Okay, so whoops. And now we can add the hidden attribute to our ID. We don't want to actually show users this value. We want to include it. We need it for our updating, but the users don't need to see these IDs. So I'm going to add to my ID input type equals hidden. And we can also just add a delete button that also shows when an employer is selected. Need to stop clicking that link. Well, you know what? We'll add the delete button next week. Okay, so we're using those ng ifs to show or hide different elements. So we're getting there. So next week, we're going to need to add methods for deleting and updating in our server API, in our Angular service, and our Angular component. And then we'll look at how do we compile and bundle the Angular app. right now they're two standalone applications, right? To deploy them, we'd have to upload each repository and connect them. But we have a way to integrate the Angular front end into the Node backend. So that's what we're going to do next week. Next week is our last class before your tutorials. In 2 weeks, it's Good Friday, so we don't have a class. You do have a quiz for this week. It's not due until next Thursday. You have a week to do it. But if you check the checklist in lesson 11, so there is a quiz. The quiz is on Angular. I believe it's only 5 questions. It's due next week. Okay, so I will get work marking assignment 3. I'll have them marked next week. And I'll send out an answer. We can also look maybe having class lunch next Thursday. People don't have class. So maybe next Thursday we can get together for anybody who's interested, either on campus or somewhere near the campus. Okay, so I'm going to upload everything to GitHub. I've got to get running because I do have a meeting that I have to get to for 11 a.m. that I have to be at. Okay, so have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll see you on Wednesday.